Okay, I have to say got it to get that off my screen. Okay, thank you, Atama. It's good to be with the group today. We're all in different time zones and from a number of places, and I'm very encouraged that you are tuning in because you want to learn more and grow as a Christian. And if you're not growing, life will not go well. That's just generally true for anyone. I'm 81 years old now, and I'm trying to grow, and I'm reading books. I just got back from a 2-day little spiritual retreat, getaway. Read one book, did a lot of praying, listened to a lot of Christian music. I just do things to try to keep growing. And that's the purpose of what Atama is doing here in the Sunday school program. He's got a different title than The Power of Discipling, my book, because he's talking about really what happens when you don't have discipling functioning correctly. And so I'll explain, I think, as we go through the lesson, why he chose that. I will say that I got involved in this group, which I used to call the discipling movement back in the 1980s. And I got acquainted with it in 1981. And in 1985, I officially joined it by becoming the evangelist for the church in San Diego at the time. But one of the first series that I preached after I met this group was the missing ingredient. And I talked about discipling being the missing ingredient because we did not have that in the mainstream churches of Christ, of which I was a part at the time. And so I got involved because of the concept as I understood it, and it appealed to me, and I'll explain more about why the appeal was so great. But at any rate, I did write a book, a long book, back in, I think, 1997, that we just called Discipling. That was all of the term that we could come up with, Tom Jones and me, in that particular book. And so we called it Discipling, but then Tom thought of a subtitle that I thought was great. It was God's plan to train and transform his people. And that's really the design of discipling, to make us more like Jesus, to make us more like him in every way, and to make him effective, or make ourselves effective like him in helping people get right with God. And so the book was rather long, and there were those that felt like it needed to be shorter for newer Christians, which I agreed with. So it was condensed down into what is called Power of Discipling today. And 5 chapters were actually omitted. I added 2 back in as 1 chapter on group discipling and family discipling sometime later. But it is a shorter book, but I think it has the essence of what I wanted to get across covered very, very well. And so as we talk about discipling today, we're going to talk about some things that need to happen that are not happening. It's interesting that Atama, I think, got inspired to ask me to do this lesson based on another book of mine, My 3 Lives. And in that book, I talked about what happens when you don't have discipling, and I use the lens of our present movement and its growth or lack thereof to make the point. And so some of what Atama brought up with me, I will be actually covering in the lesson itself. But let me go back to my spiritual beginning and how I got interested in going in the first place. As a young married guy, my wife dragged me to church until finally it started catching on, and I really got interested. And so at that time, there were verses that were taught and mentioned, and to me, 2 and 2 equals 4. And so I looked at these verses and I thought, wait a minute, there's something not happening. There are things that we're not doing that we need to be doing because the world needs to be saved. I mean, very basic verses. Let me read a few of them. 1 Timothy 2 and verses 3 and 4. He says, "This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth." So God wants all people to be saved, which means that all people are not saved, obviously. And then in 2 Peter 3, verse 9, he says, this is good. No, I'm sorry. Skip the verse. He says, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. Everyone. And then in Luke, this is paralleled in Matthew 7 in more detail, but I like the way Luke puts it because it raises a question. It says, then Jesus went through the towns and villages, teaching as he made his way to Jerusalem. Someone asked him, Lord, are only a few people going to be saved? Now, why would they ask the question? It was obviously because of what he was teaching. That's why they asked the question, because it seemed from what he was teaching that most people weren't saved, weren't going to be with God in eternity. And so they asked the question. And then Jesus said, make every effort. There are a few times in the New Testament when that term is used, make every effort. This is one of them. All of them are worth studying because we rarely make every effort for anything. And yet he says, make every effort to enter through the narrow door, because many, I tell you, will try to enter and will not be able to. And in Matthew 7, the parallel, he talks about the wide road, the narrow road, fewer those on the narrow road, many are they on the wide road. So he says clearly that most people are not saved. And so when I was introduced to passages like that, and then, of course, the Great Commission, he says, therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. When he gives us that commission before his ascension back to heaven, then my thinking was, wow, the world is lost. God wants it to be saved, wants everyone to repent, everyone to know the truth. We've got to do more about it. At the time, I was actually a teacher. I was a band director in junior high school, later high school. And so I was thinking, okay, Gordon, the work that you're doing here hopefully will influence people to be better, your example, and whatever you teach them by way of just basic life lessons, that will help them, but it's not going to get them to heaven. They need to be taught. And so in that church, if you got really fired up about helping people know God, they were uncomfortable and said, you need to go to school and become a preacher. And so that's what I did, because the concept of everyone sharing in their realm of influence, whether it be school or job or neighborhood or family or whatever, that was not the concept. And so if you really wanted to change the world, you had to go and become an official preacher like I ended up doing. I'm glad I did that. But looking back, I could have done tons more than I did in the setting I was in, like all of us can and like all of us should. So to me, the real trick to getting that done, the real key to getting that done, is tied in with the concept of discipling, or I also will talk about the term discipleship, because I think there is a difference in the two, and it's important to understand that. In Matthew 28, I think he's talking about the whole concept of discipling. And so you help people learn enough to get baptized into Christ, and then you teach them to obey everything Jesus commanded. So you are in their life, helping them grow and change for all of their life, because none of us are doing it perfectly, right? We all need discipling in order to be able to do that. To me, the term then discipleship is broader. Discipleship is the whole package. I think it has a vertical aspect concerning our personal individual relationship with God. And then it has the horizontal aspect so that we are in each other's lives in a discipling relationship. And that helps us do the vertical the right way in having that relationship with God that he wants. So the horizontal are one another relationships. And of course, it's been pointed out many, many times that in the New Testament, you have the phrase one another or each other over 60 times specifically mentioned, and then tons more times the concept of being in each other's lives without using one of those phrases. You still have the concept. And so God obviously knows that we're not going to be for him. We're not going to be his image bearers, to use Thomas' phrase. We're not going to be image bearers and reflect God to people in a way that changes them unless we have help from one another. And so we've got to have both aspects of vertical and horizontal and understand both of them. When I think about the vertical relationship with God, I think about Romans 12. I love this passage. He says in verses 1 and 2, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." That's about a vertical relationship with God, I believe. He says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." You know, the world, when they think about going to church, they think in terms of vertical. They think, okay, this is the time of the week that I dedicate an hour or two to God, and then the rest of the time I do my thing. But I need to go to church and have this relationship with God, this vertical relationship. So they go into a crowd of people in their minds for the purpose of having some time with God, whereas Romans says 24/7, all day, every day, we are a living sacrifice to God. Our relationship with God, the vertical aspect, is not confined to any building. It's all the time. But in order for it to become that and remain that, we do have to have the horizontal part, the one another relationships where we are in each other's lives. And so when Jesus calls us, he's calling us to have both types of relationships, vertical and horizontal, but he is not kidding when he calls us. The very first thing he says, "If anyone would come after me, let him first deny himself." You got to be able to do that to be a follower of Jesus, and that is the hardest command in the Bible, is to deny self. At least it is for me. I'm a self-focused guy. I need help. Otherwise, I become selfish. And I need people in my life if I'm going to maintain the relationship with God and fall in love with him with body, soul, mind, spirit, and everything that I am. And so we have to have all of this. Jesus said, "If anyone would come after me, let him first deny himself, take up his cross daily," Luke said, "and follow me." And so there is a challenge. There is a commitment challenge that is a very serious challenge, and it never diminishes. And a lot of us forget that. We get comfortable, or in terms of Revelation 3, we get lukewarm, or Revelation 2, we lose our first love. And yet we can't cool down if we are going to be an image bearer and reflect God to people. I was talking to someone years ago, an older guy at the time, younger than I am now, by the way. But I was talking to him about total commitment, a term we used a lot. We said to be a disciple, you got to be totally committed to Christ. And the guy gave me a clarification. I thought that was good. He said, the way I put it is, we need to have the perfect commitment of an imperfect life. And so no matter how perfect our commitment is, how total it is, we still have an imperfect life. And therein lies the necessity of having other people in our lives to help us. And so the whole discipling concept is that the goal is to be like Jesus. That's what it means to obey his commands. He said, after we're baptized, we're to be taught to obey everything that Jesus commanded. In a nutshell, it's a way of saying that we are to become like him, more and more like him. And so 1 John 2 puts it this way, first few verses. He says, we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, I know him, but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know that we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. So obeying the commands of Jesus, the Great Commission, and its directives. The Great Commission is all about imitating Jesus, but that means we need help because we don't see ourselves as we are clearly, and we need other people looking at us and helping us see ourselves clearly. We need people encouraging us. We need people calling us back when we are slipping off the path of following Jesus and imitating him. And so it's basically family functioning to help one another be like him. Now, the term discipling, I love. It drew me into this movement of churches. It was the main thing. There were other things, but it was the main thing. But to a lot of people in our movement that are older, the word discipling itself does not carry a positive feeling. So I want to talk about how the discipling train went off the tracks. And I'm going to be very specific because I watched it go off the tracks. I think it was on the tracks in a wonderful way in San Diego for the time that I was there. When I moved to Boston, I saw things that said, wait a minute, something is going awry. And so we had some history before Boston. They went back to Gainesville, Florida, and the Crossroads Church days. It was a big campus ministry movement, and I call that period of our history as a movement, I call that period of our history the campus movement days, because it focused a lot around that. So when I first got in contact with it, I remember Tom Brown telling me that they had prayer partners. And I said, goodness, I said, prayer partners, that sounds intriguing. What do prayer partners do? He said, well, we get together and we talk about what we're struggling with. We talk about what our plans are. We talk about our dreams. We help each other be more like Jesus. I mean, it was a very simple explanation. But one time in Boston, in the Boston movement phase of our overall church movement, in the Boston movement days, I was there with Kip McKean, who had gotten the Boston church really going, and it led to the Boston movement phase. And he used to say that the movement started in 1979 when he moved to Boston. And so I said one day, listen, I used to go down to Crossroads. I know about the campus ministry and what went on down there and the hundreds of people that were baptized there, including you, by the way. And so why would you say the movement began in 1979? And that was commonly taught in those days. And he said, well, there are three reasons. He said, number one, we don't have a church within a church. We don't have two levels of commitment, because at the time, the Crossroads Church was sending a group of campus ministry people into existing churches to try to start a campus ministry movement. And they were all fired up and evangelistic and discipling and doing a lot of things. But the older members of the church did not necessarily get on board. And so there was sort of a double commitment, a two-level thing going on, which was, of course, not only unhealthy, but it was unbiblical. And so Kip said, we're not going to have that. There's going to be one common commitment level based on the Bible and Jesus' call to discipleship. I said, okay, that sounds good. He said, secondly, in order to avoid that setting, we're not going to have campus ministry groups go into existing churches and run into all of the problems of two levels of commitment. He said, we're going to do church plantings. We're going to send out a committed group and do a full church planting so that from the start, everyone is on the same page. I thought, okay, that sounds good. But then the third thing is, he said, the difference in us here in Boston and in the Crossroads setting is that they had prayer partners, but we have discipling partners. And that was a big point that he made. And basically, I came to understand quickly that that came to mean that discipling partners was sort of a military model. It was one person over the other person, one person with authority over the other person. And so it was kind of a one-way street in relationship. It's not that you weren't encouraged to be friends, but discipling went one way. In fact, my good brother Wyndham Shaw and I, he was discipling me when I first went to Boston. I said, no. I said, that's wrong. If you're going to disciple me, I need to be able to talk to you about what I see in your life. And we had a long talk about that. We walked around a fairly large lake twice, but he bought into it because that was just Wyndham's heart. And he understood, yeah, if we're going to be discipling partners, we need to be able to help each other, not just have a one-way street in a military model. But that was definitely the pattern that was set up. And out of that, the train went off the tracks. And so the concept of having authority over somebody else and telling them what to do and being their authority, and sometimes their only authority that was in their lives, that created lots of problems. And that caused the upheaval that Atama mentioned earlier back in about 2003, because the authority concept of me being your basic spiritual boss was a bad idea that created a lot of problems. And so without going too much more into that history, I did write a chapter about that in my book on leadership, my second one, entitled Dynamic Leadership. I have a whole chapter on the military model of leadership and why that is unbiblical and why it hurts people and doesn't work. And the train went off the tracks with that. Now, having said that, there are situations where one person is definitely more mature than the other and is mentoring them. For example, you have an intern on church staff, an older, more mature person, man or woman, whichever it is, someone is going to be mentoring or helping that other person. Make sure my sound is up here. Somebody said the sound is not doing good. Sorry about that. It's all the way up, so I'll be a little closer. But at any rate, if you have an intern on a staff, someone more mature is going to be training them. And so there's a training aspect. And then you have a new convert, Matthew 28, and someone is teaching them to obey everything that Christ commanded. And so certainly in that setting, you've got a mature person helping another person mature. And so it's an apprenticeship type thing. You're helping them grow. You're mentoring them. And then even in a relationship with two people that are fairly equal spiritually overall, maybe one brother, for example, is having purity problems and the other brother is not. He's strong in that area. And so he helps him. He mentors him in that area. But on the reverse side, maybe one guy is not doing very well with finances, but the other guy, even though he's got a problem with his purity, he's great in finances. And so he mentors that person in that way. Basically, it is a dual relationship where we are helping each other grow. And that is what it is all about in that area. But the concept of authority, one over the other, who is actually being sort of a boss over the other one, that has created the problems that have hurt our movement, and it is creating the problems that cause people to back off of the concept of discipling. And if discipling is everything that I believe it is, biblically and practically, then I would say that Satan, unsurprisingly, has gone after it as strongly as he can to try and derail it. And sadly, he has been successful with many of our members at this present time. They do not practice discipling in the way that I think it should be practiced. So as we think about imitating Jesus, and therefore obeying his commands, but imitating Jesus, becoming like him, reflecting him to the world. And so as we study the Bible with people, they're reading two Bibles at once. They're reading the one in print, and they're reading you. They're reading me. They're looking at us. They're seeing, does your life match up with what you are teaching me? And so I look at some components of that. As we teach people to imitate Christ, as we disciple someone, mentor someone, encourage someone, help someone to imitate Christ, what are we doing? We're trying to get them to develop the character of Jesus. That's one thing. His heart, his attitudes, his focus on God. We're trying to get people with the heart of Jesus. And we need help with that on the positive side, but we also need help with that on the negative side, in the sense that we need help avoiding what will stop that. We need to avoid sin. I remember one of the first definitions I heard of discipling. I read it in a book in manuscript form way back before I got involved in the movement. But it simply said this, that discipling is God's way of protecting us against sin before it becomes full grown in our lives and hurts us or even destroys us. And at that very moment, I had one of my very close relatives, a first cousin, who had been in church and spiritual all of her life. Her husband had not been, but he became that, and he was doing better. The family was coming together. It was such an exciting time for our whole family. And yet she got involved as a volunteer in a Christian school that her church operated. And she got in a relationship with the principal of the school. They were all a part of this church. It's still a well-known Church of Christ, by the way, but a mainstream Church of Christ. But she got involved with this guy, and she ended up having an affair with him. And even though both of their mates were willing to work it out and forgive them, they wouldn't do it. They divorced their mates, they damaged their families irreparably, and they married each other. And it was a horrible thing in our family. It was a horrible thing in that church fellowship. And then I read that definition of discipling and thought, what if my cousin had a discipling relationship and started confessing sin at the temptation level? She would have never gotten to the point of destroying her marriage and her spiritual life and her family. And so that kept me up 3 nights. I tell about it in some of my books. I literally did not sleep for 3 nights because I thought of one person after another person that, had they practiced a discipling relationship and confessed sin at the temptation level, it would have kept them close to Jesus and not permitted Satan to come in and virtually destroy their lives. And so that definition of Jesus, of discipling, helps us be like Jesus because we stay on the path. We don't get off the path. And that is fundamental. So I need to become like him, his attitudes, his heart, all of that. I need to become like him, but I need help in doing that and not straying from the path of doing that through sin. So that's one thing, the character of Jesus. But then on the other side, we need to imitate the relationships that Jesus had, because the people he was around were like us. They were sinners. And what did he do with them? He was constantly working on them to help them grow. He was always thinking about how they could be a better form of themselves. He didn't just hang around with them and fish or drink coffee or whatever they drank in that day. He was always working on them to improve and grow spiritually. And that should be the same goal that we have as we are with people, is not in a negative way of just bugging the tar out of them all the time with what was wrong with them, but in just very positively and lovingly helping them keep growing. I've thought about what it would be to have been one of the 12 following Jesus all the time. Can you imagine what would have happened if he had constantly pointed out everything that was wrong with them, everything they did, every thought that they had? I mean, he could have killed those guys because he knew everything about them. He didn't do that. He was their friend, but he was always working on them at a rate that they could handle to keep growing and becoming more like him and more like the Father. And so that is something that discipling needs to contain, that we're always trying to help people become a better version of themselves and a better version of Jesus, not in a negative way of critique and correction all of the time, like some have perceived discipling to be, not at all, but to encourage people and to help them have a greater vision of what God can do in their lives and with their lives. So the relationships of Jesus that he had, we need to imitate those relationships in a discipling setting. And then the overall mission of Jesus. We need to disciple people about that mission and how to do it better. In Luke 19:10, it says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." That was his mission, to help people get saved. And that was the thing that I think got Thomas' attention in my book, My 3 Lives, because I had some statistics in that book about the fact that we simply are not doing the job. And I will say this, Atama was one of those that was convicted by those statistics and concerned and wanting to do something about them. I will say that I got more kickback from older established leaders about putting those statistics in the book than I ever got on anything else I put into print. Because we have a way of hiding how things are actually going as far as us affecting the world and carrying out the Great Commission. And so in 1916, I'm a century behind. 2016, I wrote that book, My Three Lives, and put the stats in it. The stats were for 2015, and it showed that our movement of churches in 2015 was 1.9%, less than 2% growth. Tama told me, he said, I don't know how it has done since then. Back in that year, the United States and Canadian churches had grown 1.3%. That's all. And then I had some other statistics in there, and I offended people by putting them in there. But to me, you need to know where you are. How can you possibly improve if you don't know where you are? And it has been very difficult, to be quite honest. It's been very difficult to get the statistics about the growth of our movement every year. I've managed to do it, but even with my influence, it has not been an easy thing to do. And so since 2015, we've grown 1.2% in 2016, 1.3% in 2017. The U.S. churches that year less than 1%. Then in 2018, 1.3% again. And that year they put 3-year stats in and 5-year statistics and 11-year statistics to make us feel better if you spread it out more, because it was better in the early days and clearly slowing down now. I thought it was interesting, this statement that was in there. It was actually in the statistics that were put out. It says detailed information is for leadership only. That's offensive to me. That's not vulnerability. We are a family. This is not the church of the leaders. This is the church of Jesus, and this is the church of all of us. We are a part of the family. And so that comment was offensive to me, and it's offensive that that some of the statistics are held back and not shared. I think people need to know we are not growing. 2019, 0.8 growth. 2020, 0.8 growth. And that resulted, as I looked at the numbers, about 110 growth of membership in the United States. 110 people is all. When you look at how many are converted, restored, and how many leave, 110 people left. That was the actual growth in the U.S. 21 and 22, we are in the minus now, as I expected we would be, because we are going downhill in our growth. Well, why does that really matter? Why did Atama get concerned about that? Because I had some other terms in there as well, numbers in there as well. I had the number of people that are born every year. And actually, Atama, I looked that back up, and we're either having a much faster growth rate, or I had the wrong stats back then, because I got off the web yesterday that the UN estimates that around 385,000 babies are born every day, and that amounts to 140 million a year. Then you look at the death rate, and we have every day 167,000 people dying. That's 61 million people a year dying. And unless the word about Jesus gets out and people become Christians and get saved, then those are dire statistics to look at to start with. We are not making the impact that we once made as a movement. In the early years, we grew fast. We planted churches all over the world. It was phenomenal. And I've visited many of those churches in places outside my home country, and it's so exciting, so encouraging. And yet, all over the world, we are having problems in most places with our growth. And so what is all that produced? I think a lack of discipling is behind it. If we were really in each other's lives, helping us be more like Jesus, we would make an impact like he did. Not as big as he did, but it would be the same nature of impact that he made. And so what we have going on right now is we have a burnout of leaders. We have a lot of people that don't want to lead because they have tried, they have found people not responsive, they have found people not in each other's lives, helping us to grow and to change and to represent Jesus and to have the impact that he did. And so you've got burnout, and then you have a comfortability level that is scary. We have settled down now into a level of people being very comfortable if they just go to church. They're not thinking about evangelizing. They're not thinking about being in each other's lives. They're not practicing discipling. And so therefore, we have become like those churches in Revelation 2 and 3. We have become lukewarm. We have lost our first love. We are not what we once were. And therefore, we're not having the impact that we once were, that we felt like then was going to take the world. We're going to get the gospel into the world and give everyone an opportunity to either say yes or no to Jesus, but they're going to learn about him and learn what his call is and his plan is for them. We had that hope and that dream, and that drove us. But now, not many of us have that dream left. I got an email from a young guy the other day that said he had it, and he wanted to know what to do with it and how he could see it carried out. There are still some young people that want it, and there's some of us older guys that are not satisfied with where we are. We want to see the church actively engaged in helping each other change constantly to be more like Jesus and to have the impact that Jesus did have. We have reached, and this is to me a very scary thought, we've reached the point in my country, in America, that is now called post-Christian. And I think that is accurate. I happen to live in the Bible Belt. Down here, you can still pray in public and nobody's going to say anything. You can still do certain things in the Bible Belt that won't be thought totally weird by a good number of people. But there are other people that are quite outspoken about Christianity, and they have some things I'm outspoken about too. So-called Christianity that's a long way from what I read about in the Bible. We've got a form of it in the evangelical world that I think is, in many cases, a far cry from what Jesus actually taught and stood for. But the point is, we are in a period of time where persecution is going to be not just an idea that we read about in the first century or in China or in some other country taking place. It's going to be here. And it's going to get tougher and tougher to be a Christian and to speak out for your faith. And I think it's going to separate the sheep from the goats. I think we're going to find out what we're made of. I think we're going to find out, are we willing to stand up for Jesus and suffer some of what he said people were going to suffer in the first century and beyond in the early days of Christianity? I think that time is coming. And my conviction is, unless I have discipling in my life, discipleship vertically and horizontally, unless I have that, I will not make it. I really believe that. And so I have very strong convictions about this thing we call discipling. If I'm not growing, if I don't have people helping me grow and change, then when the fires of persecution come, and they will, inevitably they will, when they come, and the force that they will come in, we're going to have very deep convictions, and we're going to have a family that helps us be what Jesus is calling us to be. So that's a sobering thought. There's some sobering thoughts in all of this, but also in this, there are some delightful thoughts about what it means to be family and be in each other's lives. I got an email or a text message a few weeks back, and Bruce and Robin Williams, we were together in Los Angeles. Bruce and Robin said, listen, we want to drive to see you. We're on a trip. We won't have that long. But I'm telling you, they drove a long way to get to our house about 3 p.m. on New Year's Day. We stayed up late that night talking and reminiscing and all of that. We know everything about each other's lives. We've been in discipling relationships. There's nothing held back. And we talked into the night. And they had to leave at 7 the next morning, but they went to all of that trouble to spend some time, because we know what discipling is like and what it's done for our lives. And that's why we love each other the way that we do, that we would go to that much trouble. So the question is, do you have those kind of relationships? If you have relationships that have helped you change and helped you grow, and people that know everything about you and still love you and want to help you grow, if you have those kind of relationships, you'll be just fine. If you don't have those, and if you're like most church people and you just go to church and you have this little vertical relationship here with God for an hour, and you don't have people in your life the rest of the week, and all you do on Sunday is say hi to some people and have very shallow conversations and very little on the spiritual depth side, if that's the kind of religion that you have degenerated into, or you see people around you that have degenerated into that, then obviously this is a needed lesson. And so with that thought and that intent, that's what I've got to say at almost 8 o'clock Central Standard Time.
Thank you so much for your lesson, Gordon. I think it was awesome just to get the sweep of just the obviously biblical context to start with, and then what that means for us practically on an individual, but definitely on a church level.